Good afternoon. Thank you, Koiki-san. I would really like to thank you very much to the administrators of the symposium for inviting me. This is my 5th trip to Japan now, so I have never said no to an invitation to come to Japan. So thank you again. In most places in the world, people would be very surprised to hear a talk about brown bears in a conference about overabundant wildlife. Because the problem, of course, in most of the world is that bear populations are declining and there are big conservation issues. But as we've heard in Japan, you have some damage problems and other problems with both brown bears and black bears. And actually in several places in Europe and also in the United States and Canada, populations are increasing. And in some places leading to problems. Now, I guess large carnivores don't get to be overabundant in the same way that ungulates do, in that they have a lot more effective population limitation behaviors. But still, if we think about overabundance in terms of the social economic level at which people accept these species, then bears fit into this category. So I would like to tell you a little bit about the story of the brown bear management in Sweden. Now, one thing that's probably different than what we were hearing about in Japan is that in Sweden has a professional wildlife management agency and staffed with biologists, and they've also been funding a one research program that called the Scandinavian Brown Bear Research Project for 27 years. So they have an excellent database on which to make their management decisions. So we will talk a little bit about, have they done that? First, let me tell you a little bit about the research project. It is based on individually marked bears. There's 2 study areas, main study areas. We started in the northern mountainous area in 1984, and there we've captured 249 individuals and marked them. In the south, we started 1 year later and have put radio collars on 435 individuals. This is a rolling boreal forest area with very intensive forest management. Now, just recently, we've started a small study on brown bear predation on reindeer, also in northern Sweden. We capture these bears from a helicopter, and that allows us to follow females and capture all of their young. So when they come out of the den with the young that are 1 year old, then we go in and we capture the mother and her yearlings. So we're basically following all the bears from their born, even though we don't mark them the first year, we follow their mother until they die, is our methodological goal. And this allows us to follow a large number of bears. We started with and still use this VHF technology, and now we're putting, these are GPS collars, the red and the green. The red is also implanted transmitters in addition to the GPS. And you see that at least in the last 15 years, we've had followed between 80 and 100 bears per year. And this gives us pretty unique and amazing pedigrees. So you see many of these now are 5 or 6 and 7 generations long, which gives us the opportunity to make some very fascinating studies of life history, strategies, and heritability, etc. But of course, one of the problems when you're doing life history studies like this, you don't really want to have a hunted population because the hunting mortality complicates things. But of course, we do have a hunted population. And most bear populations in the world suffer a lot of human-induced mortality. But at least from all of the hunter-killed bears, we get the data on age, sex, location, weight, and samples of tissues, hair, reproductive organs, etc. And of course, this is very important to include these hunter-killed bears because we are doing this for management and we're funded mostly by the management authorities. Now, we've really done what we can to try to give the managers a basis on which to base their management. And one thing that we've done is we've designed and tested a method for estimating population size based on the DNA from collected feces. So we've mobilized the moose hunters in Sweden, and they've gone out when they're hunting for moose and find a bear scat. They will pick it up during the time that we tell them. They'll take a small sample, put it in a tube, write down when and where they found it, and then send it into a central place, and they will preserve it in alcohol, send it to genetics labs, and find out which individuals they are. And we do that for each, well, you can't see the counties, but there's each one of these designates a county, and from that we can use capture-recapture technology or software to estimate population sizes. So here's the number of samples. You can see that we get in for each county, percentage with DNA, number of individuals. And these locations here are the locations of about 11,500 samples collected by these hunters. And if we, here is the relative density of these samples. And the interesting thing is we can look at relative densities 3 different ways and all give the same answer. So the density of collected scats reflects the density of the bears. So we've also designed a method to test changes in the population size. And the way we've done that is also using the hunters who are very motivated in Sweden, highly organized into hunting groups. And for many years, they've been reporting the moose that they see when they're hunting moose during the first week of the hunt. Not only the number of moose they see, but they also report how many hunters were out hunting each day and how many hours they were hunting. So we have added bears to this this method that was already in place, and we could so we get the number of bears seen per 10,000 hunter hours is what we use per year, per county. And these are the trends that we have in these 6 counties with bears. And in 4 of those, we've detected statistically significant increases since 1998. one of the disadvantages of this method, of course, is that you have to get several years of data before you estimate a trend. And if the harvest rate is changing fast during this period, then your trend estimate is sort of biased because of that. But anyway, this is a very good trend estimator. And we've tested this looking at the individuals per 100 square kilometers within hunting areas based on the DNA surveys I told you about and the observations per 1,000 hours. And you see that for every county we get a very good statistical relationship. The one thing to point out, though, is that some of the counties you get a different relationship. And this one is in the north. It has very open forest, lots of bogs, so we think it's easier to see a bear. So that means that you can't compare, you know, for a given number of observations per 1,000 hours, I should say, you won't get the same density here as you do over here, just because it's easier to see a bear. But within an area, you should be able to follow it from year to year. And just to give an advertisement for the project, we really have done a good job, I think, to publish our results, get it out to the managers, and we write a lot of reports for them, but also a lot of scientific publications, and with an increasing rate. So here they have, I would say, probably one of the best bases of scientific knowledge in the world to manage a brown bear population. So did that result in a well-planned long-term management of this population? We'll first, before I talk about that, I will give you a little bit of history. And there's the management of Sweden's brown bear has gone through several different paradigm changes. And these are actually the estimated population size. We have an estimate from the 1850s of about 1,700 bears. And starting in 1647, the Swedish government has done everything they could to exterminate the bear. There was a national policy that bears should be exterminated in Sweden. And that policy ended in 1892. And because the hunters themselves, in fact, said that they didn't want to exterminate the bear. There were so few left, they thought we should save the bear. And also the Swedish Academy of Sciences said it would be a shame for Sweden to lose the bear. So they stopped. In 1892, the way that they were financing this extermination was with very, very generous bounties. So people were paid a lot of money to shoot bears. Then from 1893 to 1927, there was successively stronger and stronger protection of the bears. And in 1943, after a survey of bears, they concluded that there were probably enough bears to start hunting again. And then in 1981, they started regulating this harvest even more by area-specific quotas, and our research study started in 1984. And these changes were also evident in the distribution, where you can see that the green is where the bears were. By 1850, the bears were already reduced from large parts of the most accessible parts of Scandinavia. and they gradually were survived only in the more remote areas, and by 1920 there were only about 4 populations left in the mountains of Sweden that survived. And then they started increasing again, you see, and today here is found over about as large a part of Sweden as they were in 1800, in the beginning of the 1800s. Now, it's very important to tell you there are some parallels with Japan, actually, and one is that after World War II, Sweden decided that they needed to industrialize. And they did that in a big way, and of course they needed workers. And there were a lot of people out in the countryside on rather marginal agricultural areas. So the state stopped paying subsidies to support these small farmers. And of course, losing those subsidies, then they were more or less forced into the cities to the factories. They also had foreign workers coming in too because of this great need for industrial labor. And the result of this now is that on half of the area of Sweden, we find only 5% of the Swedish population. And that is here, and that's where most of the bears are. And that's also where most of the lynx are, and the wolverines, and not so much wolves, but this really also helped give an area where there were less conflicts with these increasing populations of large carnivores. Okay, now I'm going to go through these phases of management, and I want you to notice here are the population sizes in red and the harvest rate. And just so you know, as I've used population size on the same line here, but 10 times greater than the harvest. I can tell you right away that it looks like that's what's relatively sustainable. About 10 or 11% of the population can be hunted for a stable population. So that's why I did that. So here it starts at 1911. So there were no bounties placed on and they were protected, the bears were protected on state lands. So you see there was quite a low harvest rate. There were also very few bears. And to protect them even more, in 1927, the state made all dead bears state property. They belonged to the king. And what they did was effectively remove the economic value of bears. So here, you could still shoot a bear on your own private land, or if a bear was causing problems or whatever, you still could sell the meat and the skin. So there was some incentive to kill them. Here, all incentive was removed. If you did kill a bear, the state took it. And you see, everybody quit killing bears. The population at that time, we think, could have been low as about 130 bears, and in 4 different small relic populations. So a very critical situation. Then hunting was started in 1943. It was a short autumn season, and it occurred in 2 areas in Sweden. And the population increased very slowly. They thought maybe there were about 300 bears when they started the hunting season. And you can see, these are quite rough estimates, by the way. But it looked like a very slow increase during this period. And the reason why we think this increase was slow was because, you see, the harvest was very close to 10 times, The harvest was close to about 10%, it looks like, which is stability. And if we look at what the hunters reported as if the population was increasing or not every year, and what a relative harvest rate here, we see that actually following high harvest, the hunters started reporting a decrease in the population. So we really think that during this period, there was some harvest that caused the population to go down. Okay, then in 1981, the harvest became regulated with quotas. So the state not only said where you could hunt bears and for how long time, but also regulated it with quotas. And everyone is allowed to hunt bears in Sweden. There's no license required. You just have to have a weapon that is big enough to be allowed to shoot a bear with, and you have to have the permission from the landowner. And usually you have to pay for that, and then you have to pay when you shoot a bear. But anyway, that means that all of the moose hunters in Sweden are potential bear hunters. And when somebody shoots a bear, you have to notify the authorities the same day. And then when they reach the quota for that county, they will close the season. You see this period here of very low harvest. That was when there was a very big pressure from the hunters because the population was increasing to increase the quotas. The biologists, management biologists, did not want to increase the quotas, so they made a compromise. They increased the quotas, but they introduced female quotas, which they made quite low. And they said, okay, to the hunters, you say you can tell the difference between males and females, then you can shoot more bears, just shoot males. But of course, hunters cannot tell the difference between males and females, and you see the harvest was very low in this period. Now, in 1994, we estimated that there were about 700 bears in Sweden. And we also, Kaji-san told about the underestimation of red deer. We also underestimated the bears. There probably, now we know with our DNA censuses, there were about 1,000 bears at that time. I think I have it here. But still, that the population had increased quite a bit from this time, and that the population was growing at 16% per year. That's the highest growth rate ever recorded for brown bear population in the world. So that 16% a year means that your population is doubling every 5 years. And we told the managers, we said, this is really growing fast. And we thought there were 700, which we later changed to 1,000, but they knew the population was growing extremely fast. So what do you do then? Well, they did remove the female quotas in 1997, and they started to increase the quotas very slowly. Really, it was the hunters that were pushing them to increase. And in 2003, the National Parliament made a national goal for Sweden of 1,000 bears. And that was what that was based on our population estimate of 1,000. So basically they were saying the number of bears we have right now in 2003 will be the minimum number. There was no maximum set. And actually, they said that since we still had these 4 female areas that were relics from the time when they tried to exterminate bears, they said we want the bear populations to grow together and have continuous bear population in the northern 2/3 of Sweden. So the goal was to increase, but to no set level. And the result of this management was that the population doubled in 6 years. Amazing for a brown bear population to do that. And it doubled again in the next 8 years. So now Sweden has more than 3,300 bears. And this was, as I told you, almost certainly due to the relatively low harvest. And here is data shows you that we've calculated that about 11% is what a population can withstand of our bear population for stability. And in most of the cases, you see, the harvest was way below. If it was going to be 10%, it would be at this same level. So they were following it. The harvest was increasing much slower than the population was. Now the harvest rates are getting closer. As you see here, it's increased very quickly. And now we think that we've measured the population growth rate at 4.4%. It's probably less than that because I told you the harvest is increasing so much faster that this 4.4% is overestimate. But still, it's far below 16%. So, we're talking about consequences. And has this had consequences in Sweden? And it certainly has, very much so. One thing is that, remember I told you in 2003, the government said there would be 1,000 bears and the population can just grow. Well, in 2009, they said, I think we should stabilize it. Only 6 years later, they changed the goal to a general stabilization in the country, although it can go down in some places, increase in other places. But generally, they want to stop where they are. And surveys have shown that the Swedish people are becoming more afraid of bears and also less supportive of having the bear population numbers that they have. And this is particularly in the places where people live with bears. And the number of injuries have increased. Now the Scandinavian brown bear is not as aggressive as your Hokkaido brown bear. But still, here is the increase in injuries per 5 years. You see it's declined here because we've started a research project just to see how dangerous are bears, because people were afraid of going in the forest. And so we made a project where we walked by bears. The bears were in a daybed, and we would walk 50 meters from the bear. So we had GPS on us, GPS on the bear, and we saw that the bears were afraid of us, and there was not one aggressive encounter in 300 meetings with bears. And actually, almost all of these people that were getting hurt were hunters. And they were moose hunters hunting with dogs. And they were hunting moose. Their dog would be barking, and they thought it was a moose, so they would sneak up to shoot the moose. And it was very dense forest where bears always sleep, so they don't meet people. And so when he finally met the bear, who was already angry at this aggressive dog, he was so close that the bear would attack him. And that was the first problem. Then he would shoot the bear. And this happened, the average distance they were shooting the bears at was 8 meters. And a charging bear at 8 meters, it's very difficult to kill it. But if you don't kill it right away, he gets even more angry, and people were getting injured. And we think and hope is that when we went out with this information and really got the hunters thinking that I shouldn't do that. If I think it's a moose and it's in very dense cover, maybe I should be careful because it might be a bear. We hope that that is what's led to this reduction in people getting injured. But the ladies that didn't want to go and pick berries because they were afraid of bears, they really were not the ones that were in danger of being hurt by bears. And actually, all of these are men. So men with guns are the people who are attacked by bears. But there's other things too. One is domestic reindeer calves. And we've had a study on this now and found that really there's a huge amount of mortality of these reindeer calves. And there's indigenous people called the Sami who have these reindeer, and they really do lose a lot of calves. And particularly when the first 30 days after they're born, and if they're born in forested areas. If they're up above the forest line, it seems to be okay. And also, they're a big predator on moose calves. And we've found that both the predation rate, which was here, the percentage of calves killed, and the kill rate, the number of calves killed per bear, it varies with moose density. And we measured moose density here as the number of moose per bear. And this is a log scale. But what it shows is that when you get more and more moose per bear, then the bears, more and more moose per bear, the bears are able to kill more calves because there's more calves available. But the percentage goes down. The reason I got confused is I want to say it the other way, is that if you have the same bear density and the hunters reduce the moose population because of forest damage or something, and they've actually been doing that, that means that the bears are taking a higher percentage of the moose calves. So that at least the hunters don't get to shoot as many moose calves. And if you add wolf predation, which we have in some areas, then you can make it more difficult for the moose population to come up again. Yeah, I said that. So that is somewhat of a problem, although it's maybe not as big of a problem as some of the hunters think, because the moose do not kill any adult, or the bears do not kill any adult moose. So very, very few. So that means that the loss to the hunter is that they cannot kill some moose calves. But they don't really like to kill moose calves anyway. And plus, they get to shoot bears, which they think is a good hunting item. And we've compared different carnivore ungulate systems in Scandinavia. And here is the change in predation rate, increasing predation rate, and the effect on the population growth rate. And you see bears have a very little effect on moose populations. The red fox have a very little effect on roe deer populations. The wolves have a greater effect on moose, but what really has the big effect is hunter harvest of roe deer, lynx predation on roe deer, and hunter harvest of moose. And that's because these are killing the adults. But this still causes a lot of conflict. It's not real conflict, really. I mean, it's not, the basis is, according to our research, is not really great, but the conflict can be great in some areas. But one conflict that is really true is the public costs of compensation for depredation on sheep. In Norway, loses in 2010 4,800 sheep to bear depredation, which cost 133 million yen. Sweden lost 64 sheep, which was 500,000 yen only. And when we've studied why is this so different, and we found that if you correct for the number of sheep and the number of bears, that a Norwegian sheep is 50 times more vulnerable to being killed by a bear. And the reason is simple, is because the sheep are not guarded in Norway. They just roam out in the forest, and they're very easy for all of the carnivores to kill, and actually for other people to steal, which happens also. But in Sweden, the government says, we will not pay you unless you're responsible for your sheep. So if you take care of your sheep, put them in an electric fence or something, we will pay you if a bear kills them. And they do that, and then the bears don't kill them, so it doesn't cost the government hardly anything at all. So this is a big problem in Norway and not a big problem in Sweden. Actually, I told you in 2010 it was 4,800 sheep. It's been as high as 7,000 sheep killed, and this causes enormous problems out in the rural areas. And they kill the ewes, the adult sheep, not so much the lambs. And in the last part of the fall, before they go into their dens, they just kill them and they eat the fat parts, you know, the breast fat or the udders, because they want to gain fat before they go into hibernation. So, as we're sitting here, the Swedish politicians are deciding what will be the future of the bear in Sweden, if it should be reduced a lot, reduced a little bit, or stabilized, or allowed to increase, or what. And there's being debated in the public now, and soon a political commission will publish a report, and then the parliament will decide what to do. So, what have we learned from this situation in Sweden? Well, one thing is that conservation works, which is really nice thing to know. You can have a population with a relatively low reproductive rate, like bears, and you can almost exterminate it, and then you can change your management and say, no, let's not exterminate it, let's save this species. And if you do it right, you can save it. And Sweden did. So did many other countries, as I told you, including Japan. But I think one of the problems is that it's easy for managers to get trapped into this paradigm. It's a poor, endangered species, and we have to save it. And then when this becomes successful, the population starts increasing. It's hard for these same people to change their thinking. I know that happened in Sweden for a fact. And these managers were confronted with reliable scientific information. We could tell them how fast the population was increasing. We could give them what they needed to know to let them know they were getting into this situation of a, let's call it, exploding bear population. And still they stayed with this protective paradigm. And rapid increases in carnivore populations can really cause problems to be accepted. And that was the thing about the bears in Sweden. Everybody agreed we should save the bear. We want more bears. We want a viable population of bears in Sweden. Now, a lot of people don't agree with that. I mean, they still want viable populations, but they want it a lot lower than now. So now the managers have to deal with the public that's not as supportive of bears as it was before. And they also have to deal with a new management system, because people were so upset about the national managers allowing this population to get out of control that now for large carnivore management in Sweden, this management authority has been moved from the national managers down to regional boards. And these regional boards are dominated by politicians and interest groups, hunters groups, farmers, landowners, and also nature conservation groups. But it's not, it's quite far removed from professional wildlife managers. And you say, well, maybe that's not bad. But on the other hand, when we come in with research results and just what we know about population dynamics, these people are not as, let's say, easily influenced by that. They're more influenced by what people think out in the area, you know. And so maybe that's good and maybe it's bad. I don't know. We'll see. But it's certainly a different situation. And letting the bear population grow so fast, I think, contributed to this. So next time I come to Japan, I can tell you how this all turned out. I would like to say arigato and thanks again for your attention.
大変ためになる講演ありがとうございました。5つ質問があります。ごめんなさい。スウェーデンのクマは、これまで記録にない高い個体群増加率を達成した 16% ということですけれども、そういった高い増加率を達成した、要因っていうのは何だと考えられますか。これがまず一つです。もう一つは、増加率の話は、個体群増加率の話はされましたけど、最も高い、個体群密度、生息密度はどれくらいだったんでしょうか。これが2つ目。3つ目は、このスウェーデンのクマというのはそういう、密度を自ら、制御するようなそういう行動的あるいは生態的メカニズムを持ってないんでしょうか。例えば子殺しなど。で最後の質問はですね、研究者がこれは、クマの数が増えすぎだぞと、警告を危機感を感じたという話をされましたけれども、それは、どういう側面で、そういう危険な個体数レベルにあるというふうに研究者は考えたんでしょうか。以上です。たくさん質問あってすいません。
Thank you, Wai-san. There's a lot of questions all at once, so I will try to answer them, and if I forget, you remind me. I'll start from the back. I really, I wouldn't say that the bear population was overpopulated, certainly not on an ecological point of view, but that it was reached this sociological threshold where the people didn't really accept the bears as much as before. They still accept bears a lot more in Sweden with a high population than they do in Norway with only 100 to 200 bears. So this social acceptance level changes very much, even from one country to another country. But the population has grown. The highest densities we've seen is about 60 bears per 1,000 square kilometers. And actually, we've seen that's higher density in Denali National Park, actually, in Alaska, where they're not hunted. And why they, and in these areas with high densities, and as they were increasing, we did see that, in fact, some behavioral mechanisms were coming into play to reduce this growth rate. One was that the age of reproduction, first reproduction, increased. The other was that the litter interval increased. So mothers were more often keeping their young for 2.5 years, rather than 1.5 years. It looks like the growth rate of the bears declined as the population went up, and we saw a statistical relationship. And when the young are smaller, the mothers keep them another year. And of course, that makes them less productive. And also, there was more mortality of young of the year. So now it's about 40 to 50% of these cubs die. Most of them killed by other males, by males. But some of them die because they also die more quickly if it's high population density. But why could they increase so fast? And we see that European populations have a much lower age of first reproduction, and also higher cub size, litter size, and also shorter interbirth intervals. And we've made a comparison of European populations of brown bears that have been under heavy persecution for some 1,000 years or more, and then the populations with a very short period of persecution by humans, and that would be North America and Japan. Hokkaido. This is only brown bears. And what we've found is we've correlated the female body size with the litter size. And we wanted to see, for a given body size, how much do the females invest into reproduction? And where they have been persecuted for a long time, they invest much more. At the same litter size, body size, they have much larger litters. And so we speculate that maybe this persecution in itself has made the bears more productive, just if it's a human-induced evolution. Because modeling and also evolutionary theory shows that if you have a low chance of survival, it's best to produce young as early as you can and don't grow. Produce young instead. And of course, if you're small size and there's very few bears around, you can produce these young and they survive better. So we think that one of the reasons that was easier to conserve and save the European brown bear may have been that we've helped create a bear that's easier to save. It's just more productive. And also might be the reason why the European brown bear is so shy from people, night active, and is not aggressive to people, as is the Asian brown bear and the North American brown bear and grizzly bear. So that's maybe why it's speculation so far, but certainly that's it's the highest population growth rate we've ever seen. Did I answer all of your questions? Okay, good, thank you.
他にいかがでしょうか。
非常に興味深い発表ありがとうございました。ノルウェー側で羊をかなり捕食しているということなんですけれども、そういう豊富な餌資源が、ヒグマの個体群の増加にすごく強く働いているとか、そういうことはないでしょうか。
It's so nice to see all of my bear friends here come to listen to me. Thank you for the question. It's actually a good question, but we think that the bears maybe can get larger in Norway, I mean, get fatter, but we don't think it affects the population growth rate because there's a lot of moose in Sweden, but also there's a lot of ants, so they can get protein from. And well, I guess I really can't answer that question yet because females are only now just getting into Norway. And so we have so few female bears in Norway because they were exterminated totally in Norway that I really can't answer that yet. And where the female bears are being allowed to establish are where the sheep farmers have quit farming. Because when there's too many bears, they lose too many sheep, and they kill as many bears as they can, and finally they quit farming sheep, and then the bears can establish. So in a way, they do gain from the weight from the sheep, but then the mortality is so high that. So I guess I will say we don't have the data to answer that question yet. But I would expect that it would be positive, actually, if they weren't killed so fast.
ありがとうございました。この後また質疑応答の時間を設けたいと思いますので、スウェンソン博士からの発表はこれで終わりたいと思います。